if you stand on the promenade in Davos, look through both sides, you can see this year is really feels different. Davos is different. Why? It used to be so many Chinese pavilions, Chinese participants, and this year is ASEAN. It doesn't mean China is completely replaced. I'm sure China will come back in a couple of years when we have the quarantine removed, but ASEAN is definitely rising, and there are a lot of things can connect us, and the carbon exchanges or our shared pursuit of green growth opportunity is certainly one. So that's what put us together today for this discussion. Let me introduce my old friend, Andy. Andy and I used to be co-workers at the Wall Street Journal, and then he joined the Bloomberg and lead the little conference that says to overhaul the WEF. That's the Bloomberg New Economy Forum. And then now Andy leads the China hub for Brunswick. So Andy, please will lead the keynote discussion today we'll have with Jun and Michael Sheren. Please, Andy.
Great. Thank you, Li-Xin. Actually, Li-Xin and I sat next to each other at desks at the Wall Street Journal in Beijing some years ago. It's great to be here. Thanks for the invitation. Also, a huge pleasure to introduce our two speakers who are coming to us virtually. Let me start with Michael Sheren, the co-chair of the G20 Sustainable Finance Study Group. Michael is a fellow at the Cambridge Institution for Sustainable Leadership at Cambridge University and a senior advisor to United Nations Development Program Finance Hub and an emeritus governor of the London School of Economics. Jun is the co-chair of the G20 Sustainable Finance Study Group, president of the Institute of Finance and Sustainability, and the chairman of Green Finance Committee of China Society for Finance and Banking, and co-chair of the IPSF Taxonomy Working Group. Maybe we could start at a high level talking about climate politics, climate policy, at a multinational level, national level, and then perhaps get later, if there's time, get into some of the specifics around carbon trading. And if there's time, it'd be great to open up the conversation to questions from the floor. Let me just start with a question that is live here in Davos. Coming out of COP26, there was an awful lot of momentum behind the global climate agenda. But unfortunately, the global climate crisis has collided with the global pandemic crisis, with a global cost of living crisis, with a food crisis, energy crisis, multiple crises, not least crisis of war in Ukraine. Where does that leave climate policy at a global level, the climate agenda? Maybe we could start with you, Michael.
Well, thank you very much, Andy. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'd like to thank Bo and all the folks at the Metaverse Green Exchange, and it's a particular pleasure to be with my good friend and my former co-chair, Dr. Mo Jun. It's a bit like old times. No, Andy, I think your question is extraordinarily pertinent and certainly one that should be discussed at Davos. I mean, it really is the heart of these big discussions. I think to a certain extent you're right, but I think we're getting two types of reactions. So many of the crises you outlined are immediate and they need to be addressed, but some of them automatically speak to policy changes that Jun and I worked on in the G20 and that we continue to work on around energy security that really does point clearly to green and sustainability. So I guess what I'm saying is there are some silver linings around some of these crises that will lead us towards, and it is true, you're starting to see this in several countries, including the UK, discussions around it really moving and ramping up renewable energy. And you're seeing Germany offering by 2030, 80% of their energy capacity will be renewable. So I think, throughout all of this crisis and all these things, there are some really positive effects that are coming out of this that really do lead to solving some of the crises, some of the problems around climate, and certainly some of the things that Jun and I have been working on for almost a decade now.
Jun, how do you see this playing out in China?
Well, thanks, Andy. I guess the short-term issue that you mentioned, for example, COVID crisis, energy, security issues and so on, they certainly distract the attention of the people who are working on climate change and also in our space, sustainable finance. Just give you an example of this sort of a COVID shock. A lot of countries are debating on, whether with the limited fiscal resources, I should be spending on healthcare or spending on green energy. And now a lot of countries are debating on whether I should be boosting my sort of secured supply of fossil fuel vis-a-vis investing in renewable energy, which is unstable in the short term. So these are short-term dilemma, which a lot of countries, including China, facing. But I'm still very confident that the long-term trajectory, which is committed by many countries, including China, towards carbon neutrality, are still being followed. And a lot of discussions, healthy discussions are happening at the international and country level regarding how to improve resource allocation, which is a topic we should be focusing on, allocating the private sector resource allocation so that it will enable a medium long-term transition towards net zero.
Just picking up on that point, the long-term versus short-term, Michael, it is difficult right now to get ordinary citizens focused on a climate threat, which is, 10 years, 20 years out, when the global economy faces a real inflation crisis that is devastating the incomes of ordinary households. How is that playing out in terms of national policies?
Well, in terms of the climate crisis, it's actually playing out and it's crystallizing in economic ways, literally as we speak. 2021, there was extraordinary amounts of flooding in Germany, in China. You saw fires and actually even a miniature system collapse because of drought and fire in Canada. So I guess we do need to multitask and we do need to work on these policies simultaneously, because even though people are, as you point out, there's huge inflationary issues, but almost all of those are supply driven. It doesn't make anyone's lives easier, but with war and COVID and supply chains certainly being disrupted, that is still a transitory threats, whereas the climate ones, which are playing out simultaneously, are more existential, and in many ways they're not 20, 30 years off. As I said, we're seeing those if you speak to insurance companies and in banks and other parts of the financial systems that are actually contending with these. So I guess my answer to you is that we need to be able to multitask. And I guess the hardest part to do on this is not only contend with these, but you're right, people have every single day, they've got the things that they have to work with, the cost of filling up the tank of their car, their groceries are difficult, but also they need to be told that the positive externalities towards transitioning to a more sustainable economy around not just things like cleaner air and water, but better jobs and sustainable jobs for themselves and for their children are absolutely have to be in the forefront of the discussion, because ultimately, if you just keep piling on the things that the average person globally is contending with right now, it's incredibly difficult and stressful. So I think that one part of that focus needs to be around that this transition and the need for energy security does provide those jobs, and there are positive externalities that come out of that clean energy or those clean cars. Just one fast example is we had a little girl a few years ago who died in London because of the NOx particles that came from diesel cars. Well, both China, the UK, and a variety of other countries are transitioning very quickly to electrics. And there's still some negative externalities tied to those, but ultimately the ones that are really threatening to your lifestyle, those will go away. And I think that needs to be communicated to people.
To pick up on what you just said, the upfront cost of the energy transition is going to add to inflation, at least in the short term. Margin, what is the debate around that in China now?
Well, we feel lesser pressure from the inflation side, because China's CPI inflation is still running at 1.something%, unlike many OECD countries which are seeing 10%, and so it's a lesser problem for us. But let me come back to the issue you raised, the short-term versus long-term. There are a lot of short-term decisions we need to make today, but still there are a lot of long-term decisions we, mainly the economic agents, need to make. Just to give you an example, the short-term decision I'm making is that whether I should be, riding a bicycle, or should be hiring a taxi that burns fossil fuel. That's a short-term thing, right? Which is influenced by a lot of short-term factors. For the long-term decision in the economy include, for example, I need to build a building which will last for 70 years. And should this building be a green building or net zero building, or a building that follows the current standards? That's a long-term decision. The second example is I'm building the transport infrastructure, right? It could be a road, or it could be a railway, or it could be something else. And carbon incentive could be very different by different design. So what I'm saying that in our space, the green sustainable finance, we need to make sure that most of the long-term decisions involving a lot of money from private sector versus public sector still should be gearing towards green and carbon neutrality, despite the fact that in very short term, we're facing all these difficult choices.
Michael, are we seeing long-term investment still going into that sector, or are we seeing a retreat?
I don't know if we're seeing a retreat, but as Jun pointed out, we need to make really smart long-term decisions now. A simple example is policy around how you build new build houses. I mean, they need to be energy efficient. The amount of additional or marginal increase in the cost of building a house that's better insulated and has heat pumps versus waiting 10 years now, and so many countries have already pledged net zero carbon. So some of these long-term decisions you make today actually aren't that much more expensive, but they play into it. And you've heard our friend Mark Carney talk about the tragedy of the horizons, but this is also a tragedy of the commons as well. So making good, smart, short-term decisions that play out in the long term are much cheaper and less inflationary now than waiting later and having to retrofit.
I guess if you were looking for good news, you'd be looking at Australia right now, which has just voted back in a Labor government, partly, propelled by voters who are demanding greater action on climate. Is Australia a bellwether or an exception?
I'd like to think that it's a bellwether. Certainly, that their new leader has come out saying that they want to be a renewable powerhouse. And ultimately, being with having so much sun and wind and land, it's an obvious play for Australia. But ultimately, putting that long-term investment in now around batteries, around storage, it just makes sense for both energy security as well as ultimately the economic benefits. Once these are up and running, the cost of maintaining them, whether it's a wind turbine or whether it's an electric vehicle, are much lower. So you're investing in a less inflationary and a better cost basis type of economy. So I hope they're both bellwether. It was very uplifting to see the results of that election.
Jun, how do you read public opinion in China on the climate issue now?
Well, public opinion is very much shaped by opinion leaders. Of course, initially, I guess nearly 2 years ago, it started on carbon neutrality with the government pledge. President pledged this 2060 carbon neutrality. Then I think a lot of opinion leaders, including us in the academic space, financial space, we need to educate the participants of the market so that they can fully understand the logic of that goal. For example, we, namely the China Green Finance Committee, which I chair, we published many reports, including one that's more than 100 pages, saying the following. Number one, this carbon neutrality is going to create huge opportunity for the financial sector. Opportunity would involve 470-something trillion RMB worth of green investment in the coming 30 years. So if you missed the boat, you missed most of the growth, right, as a financial firm. And we tell them what are the opportunities in terms of investing in renewable, investing low cost, low carbon transportation, in green building, industrial decarbonization, and so on. Opportunities are being identified for banks and pension funds, insurance companies, investment firms, and so on. And also we tell them that if you don't do that, you're going to end up with a lot of stranded assets. And for example, those carbon intensive assets, without transitioning towards net zero in a limited period of time, will end up with NPL ratio of maybe 20-something% in 10 years. So these are the type of analysis interpretation that's shaping a lot of market players' behavior, opinion. And I think partly as a result, I can tell you last year, our green lending went up 33%. And we now is the largest green lending market. And our green bond issuance went up 170% last year, being the second largest green bond market.
And yet at the same time, China is investing even more in coal. Coal production is hitting records. At what point do you think that these investment decisions, investments that are going in now, actually threaten China's long-term ability to meet its climate targets?
As I said, there are a lot of short-term issues, including last year we had a big power shortage. And with the shortage, we ended up with the closure of a lot of factories, and even traffic lights had to stop. And now we're facing another round of energy crisis. So it's a reaction, not just in China, but many other countries, and beginning to boost fossil fuel related activities. And once again, I would say this is a short-term reaction of certain parts of the sort of decision-making process, which I'm confident that it's going to go away when all these short-term shocks are disappearing from the what we are sort of seeing.
What I'm reading from the official Chinese press appears to be now less of an emphasis on the climate transition and more emphasis on economic stability. Is that am I misreading that, or what?
You cannot blame any economic policy maker focusing on employment, right? This is certainly something they believe as a major job of being a politician. But the question, for us in the climate space is to help them to balance the short-term and long-term goals without generating so much of a social stress in the immediate future, but at the same time steering the direction towards net zero.
Michael, in the West, the debate is playing out in a slightly different way, but in a highly polarizing way, where you have the political right accusing climate activists of destabilizing the economy, depressing investment in fossil fuels, in industry, leading to supply shortages and adding to inflation. And then on the other hand, people saying actually the economic insecurity arises from our dependence on people like Vladimir Putin exporting their oil and gas, and the answer to that is a greater investment in renewables. How do you see this debate developing over the coming years?
You're absolutely right. There does seem to be some split, and a good example, I guess, was last year in Texas, when their grid withstood, or didn't withstand actually terribly well, a large ice storm. And again, actually, it turned out it was their wind and their renewables that helped them. And it turned out again this year during severe heat. So I guess part of the discussion, and as we've talked about this several times, and this is a global issue around energy security, really the investment will ultimately provide security in getting those people who are either for ideological purposes or just simply political purposes that are on the other side of that. Just talk what it really comes down to, which is jobs. You can see in the US the amount of jobs in coal versus those in green and sustainable industries. The green and sustainable ones are increasing literally by a multiple, where those in coal continue to go down. And I guess if I can unpack a little bit more of what Jun was saying, I mean, if you think about every industry, it's going to have to either retrofit itself or it's going to have to substitute. And so involved in that is a huge amounts of opportunity for basically funding or financing that CapEx and that R&D that provides that retrofit or that substitution. And that means jobs. And I think that's really what the discussion needs to be. And that's what should cut through. And look, I wish we could say that the energy transition will be without bumps, but I think it's just almost trying to take an entire global system of energy and do it without a few hiccups in some countries is just simply probably not possible. But as long as people understand that they're getting energy security, that the path of travel is the right one, that the jobs are there and the funding, the financing is there. I mean, you obviously heard at COP27, the amount of money that was pledged towards these green investments. But that money right now is parked. It's parked in bonds and securities all over the world. And it's not moving from its current parking spot spot until you get that CapEx and that R&D. I think it was the fourth quarter of last year, Ford Motor Company put $11 billion into retrofitting their factories to make electric vehicles. That's real money from the financial system going into real jobs to grow. And I think that's got to be the message that brings the different sides together, because ultimately it's about jobs, economic growth, and energy security. And there's only one path that will lead you there, and that's around a sustainable transition in the energy field.
It seems to me that the Democrats are losing that argument that, you know, if you read the mainstream media, Biden's climate agenda is more or less dead, ripped apart by certain members of his own party.
What I do find it extraordinary is certainly not just the Democrats, and I agree that some of it has certainly been lost. I think just generally, the discussion we're having here right now, I would argue that all of these different Davos discussions should be streamed live to everyone so they can hear about it. Because if you have a good, non-patronizing discussion with your population, i.e. policymakers and politicians, about the jobs, about the energy security, about basically the free riding positive externalities, because all you're getting from the economic energy system right now, most of it are negative externalities, ultimately. And so I think one of the greatest failures, and this is not just the United States and not just the Democrats, but I think globally for policymakers, we're all talking to each other, leaders here in Davos, and we certainly talk at the G20, and we do talk in Whitehall and in Washington, but I think having good discussions and debates so people understand where the facts are and where their jobs are and where their kids' jobs are really important. And I think globally, policymakers really haven't done as good a job on this as they should have or could have.
Margin, question for you. And while I pose this question, perhaps the audience can think of some questions if there's time for one or two from the floor. One of the topics at our lunch here, the Caixin lunch today, was around whether or not the United States and China could rise above their differences over trade, over investment, over ideology, over security, and collaborate on big global issues. They obviously haven't got together and overcome deep differences when it comes to the pandemic. Do you think that these two countries, the world's two largest economies, will find common ground eventually on the fight against climate change?
That's a great question. In fact, I think one of the very few areas that China and the US are still collaborating is climate change. The other ones may be healthcare and so on, but climate change is clearly where actions are being taken. For example, my good friend Xie Zhenghua, who is the chief negotiator on behalf of China climate change, is talking to John Kerry in the past few years. And I saw a picture of him talking to John yesterday in Davos. And myself, representing China, now co-chairing the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group. I'm working with US Treasury counterpart. So it's a US-China co-chairing this working group now, which used to be co-chaired by myself and Michael Sheren back a couple of years ago. But I think the China-US collaboration on this particular initiative has been quite successful. Last year, the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group produced a roadmap which guides international work on sustainable finance in a few directions. One is the need is recognized to increase the comparability, interoperability, and eventually consistency of global sustainable finance standards. What do we mean by that? Let me give you an example of taxonomy. Michael, you remember back 7 years ago, we talked about lack of taxonomy, lack of definition of what is green. And now we have too many taxonomy, 200 taxonomies in the world. You know, everybody defines what is green in its own way, a lot of inconsistency, and it's hard for green money to move across border. Because what's green in one country may not be considered green in another country. That's one area G20 is pushing for consistency. And secondly, it's a G20 endorsement of ISSB, namely the International Sustainability Standard Board, which was launched recently. And that's going to create a set of internationally consistent reporting standards for sustainability, including carbon-related information, environmental biodiversity, and so on. And the third example is a G20 decision to create a framework on transition finance so that we can more effectively mobilize financing to support carbon-intensive companies to move towards net zero.
Yeah, a question for both of you. What should global leaders gathered here in Davos be focused on this week in discussion on the climate crisis?
No, I wouldn't speak too much on the overall climate agenda that a lot of other senior politicians are talking about. But let me focus on the financing side. I think we need to, number one, mobilize a much greater amount of private sector money for sustainable investments globally. And secondly, the OECD countries should honor its commitment to make available $100 billion per year to developing countries' climate action. And thirdly, technologies, especially green and low carbon technologies, need to be made available for emerging markets to enable them to embark on decarbonization at a lower cost.
If I can jump in, I think Jun spot on, especially when it comes to the emerging markets. And I think both being able to transfer both financing techniques, but more importantly, innovative breakthroughs. Standard Chartered did a report, I think about a month ago, and they talked about for emerging markets to get to net zero by 2060, it was going to take 100 trillion, and most of that money was going to have to come from transfer payments. And so if it takes 100, and by the way, just to give you an idea, the G20 countries are roughly 80-ish% of carbon emissions. And so if you take a look at the emerging markets, roughly say they're 20, they're probably a little bit more because I believe they include India and a few others into there. The amount of money that needs to go into that is going to be huge. So I think what people should be talking about at Davos is not just getting commitments on that money, but how to mobilize it. And it's certainly, it does require some catalysts, and certainly the IMF, the OECD, and even the G20 ministers last June came out around, should there be a carbon tax, something that mobilizes the real economy, which then would give what Jun and I are experts in, and that's the financing side, because once you have to actually start decreasing or changing your business model, if your real economy business model changes, as I pointed out before, that takes CapEx and R&D, and ultimately CapEx and R&D gets financed. And so a catalyzing, some type of catalyzing event that gets that real economy movement that allows all of us who have been thinking about how to finance it an opportunity to actually start financing it as the real economy starts moving in a sustainable direction at a far greater and a lot faster pace. So I think that's a discussion.
To that point, Michael, what is the most positive factor you can point to?
I guess my point would be the positive point is the solutions are there. The solutions that we need for a new sustainable economy are there. Basically, things like if you think about giving the sea a break, there's great substitutions for seafood, whether it be plant-based or lab-based, electric vehicles, you're seeing mobility, basically sustainable buildings. So all of the changes, all the technology for a new sustainable economy are there. Basically, we just need for that impetus, for that drive to take place to get them on. But ultimately, that, if I were to say what would be the one positive thing, and I think the Metaverse Green Exchange is a great example of that technology, being able to provide the solutions around carbon credits, because net zero carbon means net, and you can only net off against one thing, and that's a carbon credit. And so using the technology, whether it's in food, in agriculture, mobility, housing, or energy, I think is the positive thing that will take us there. And as Jun and I have been working on for over a decade now, we think we've got a lot of the tools for financing that ready to go. Jun, I'll hand over to you for final comments.
I do agree with Michael that a lot of the ingredients are ready. For example, money, technology, talents, and so on, they're just not in the right place. And they're not convened in an effective way to deliver the climate results in many countries. And that's why I think the market should be playing a much bigger role, and including exchange like the ones that we are discussing.
Jun, Michael Sheren, thank you for a fascinating conversation, and thank you to the audience. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andy, for the wonderful moderation of this, and thank you, Jun, and thank you, Michael Sheren, for joining us remotely. We hope to welcome you back to Davos in January. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Andy.